Welcome to IDP Drafts. I'm your host for this episode, Josh Raymer. For this show, we are trying to get better at IDP best ball together. And so in this episode, we're going to be looking at one of the core pieces of any sort of best ball draft. IDP, offense only, combined, Scott. I know we're going to talk about that a little bit later this offseason. But one thing you have to know is the ADP, the average draft position. Where are these players being selected in drafts? So that's what we're going to look at today, specifically some players that we're fading at ADP and who you should take instead. And joining me today for this conversation, it's Professor IDP, the master of modified best ball, Scott Soltis. Scott, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. I love talking this stuff.
Yeah, we were talking a little bit before we got on mic. This is quickly becoming, I think, both of our favorite way to play IDP best ball when it's draft and done. You can crank out a lot of these in the offseason. I think I'm up to 12 or 13 at this point. My goal is to get 20 to 25 in before the season kicks off. So, Scott, we each have our own approach to how we handle IDP best ball. How do you go about these drafts here in the offseason?
Yeah, so I like to use my gut for some of them just to see how far I am away from what the market says and what other people are. But the drafts that I really care about, that I really want to do well in, I trust the people who know more than I do. So for me, it's always been from 20 years ago when I started playing fantasy. Find the people that you really like and really respect, and where there are things that you don't know as much about, or you're trying to decide between two things, find those sort of trusted advisors. So I've already done some of my preseason scouting on defensive line, but I haven't done as much with defensive backs and linebackers. So for a lot of what I do in not just the best ball drafts, but any kind of IDP draft, is I look to Adam, because Adam has great best ball specific ranks that is really important whenever you're thinking about playing the best ball format versus other formats where floor might not be as much of a priority and ceiling is prioritized. And especially on sleeper, where you also have things like dual designations, which moves players up or down slightly. And then John Macri is someone who I've always followed for in-season rankings. So he has a very early version of his 2024 in-season rankings up across all positions. So when I went through this exercise of taking a look at where people are being drafted, I sort of made a preliminary list of, well, these are the guys that I think I would like better. Let's see what Adam and John think and see if there's some consensus there. And I'll disagree with them in some places, but I think that's a great way of finding some real value when someone's ADP is worse than what the people who you trust are saying about them.
Yeah, that's the thing is we always say on the IDP show, on the IDP after show, and on IDP drafts, we'll say the same thing, that when you go into these drafts, and it's not just to promote the website and the resources that we have over there, which are awesome, but if you're going into these drafts, specifically on Sleepers, the platform that we use for our best ball drafts, you can't trust their ADP. If you don't have a list of players and where they're being selected, you're going to get destroyed. And especially if you then don't have a set of rankings that you trust, even if you take what Adam and John or whoever else does and then kind of remix them and create your own set of rankings. If you don't have that rankings, you then can't compare which guys are values, which guys are being overdrafted compared to your rankings. So it really is essential to have both rankings and ADP when you go into these drafts. So Scott, what we're going to do today, like I mentioned, you have 4 ADP fades. These are guys that you are not taking at cost, and you are going to offer up some players that you would rather have instead. So we're hoping that if you're in these drafts, this will be a very actionable episode. So Scott, let's jump right into it. Who is your first IDP that you're fading at cost?
Yeah, my first IDP that I'm fading is Kayvon Thibodeaux. And these are all players. So both the fades and the folks I'm targeting, I'm not up to, I think you said 12 or 13 that you've done so far, or 18. I'm closer to that 10 range. But these are guys that I have actively avoided drafting, and I have actively sought out drafting. So Kayvon Thibodeaux is someone who I don't know that I have any shares of, maybe one because the ADP fell right. So the other thing I wanted to get out of the way from the jump is that isn't saying don't draft Kayvon Thibodeaux. What I'm saying is don't draft Kayvon Thibodeaux at his current ADP, which is 18.2, because I really think there are some better options out there, and I'm in good company. Eric Harms wrote an article a couple of weeks ago, and Kayvon Thibodeaux was his first fade. So I'll offer some different options there for you, but I'm very happy to be aligned with Eric on this one. So if you look at the ADP, it's 18.2. If you look at Adam's rankings, Adam has him as the 27th best ball play. If you look just within the position, he's being drafted as DL 13, but he's ranked by Adam as DL 17, and Macri has him all the way down at DL 30. So that was sort of a couple of red flags that made me feel like this instinct that, okay, I'm not taking him just because I don't know what the situation is going to look like with Brian Burns being in house now and Ojolari likely getting some rotation in there. Love Dexter Lawrence in the middle. So again, I don't dislike Thibodeaux, but there are some other directions I would rather go either within that round, looking to the next round, or just kind of doubling up a little bit later in the draft to get what I see as equivalent or better value than that single player.
Yeah, I think a big part of it with Kayvon is just prime regression candidate. Really overachieved sack wise compared to his metrics in 2023. Like you mentioned, the addition of Brian Burns. I know there's been a little bit of hype around Kayvon, wanting to be an all-time great there. You're playing at the same team where Lawrence Taylor played, and so there is this sort of legacy of excellence at edge rusher, and I think Kayvon fills that. Those are big shoes to fill. I agree. I think I don't mind taking Kayvon, but where he's being selected here, post NFL draft, ADP 18.2, puts him smack dab in the middle of the second round. There are just a lot of other options there that I feel better about. You mentioned some guys, same round, next round, later in the draft if you wanted to double up. Give us some of the guys that you'd rather take instead of Kayvon.
Yeah, and so for Thibodeaux, I was also looking because I know he has the dual designation, which is a really nice thing in best ball. And so I was looking for other dual designation guys here to sort of replace that. In terms of someone being drafted very similarly, I like Hassan Reddick. Hassan Reddick's ADP post draft is 24.6, so just about 6 spots past Thibodeaux. He's the DL 16 in those drafts, but if you look at Adams' ranks, he is overall 30, which is only 3 spots worse than Thibodeaux, but you can get him about 6 spots later. If you look at where he's ranked by Adam and John, he's DL 20, DL 18, so still a very solid value. Again, just 2 spots for Adam behind Thibodeaux in terms of defensive line, but a 12-spot jump for Macri. So if I can wait a few more picks and get someone who I think has the same kind of ceiling, same dual designation, some of the same questions around, because he's in a I know Thibodeau's in the same environment. Reddick's in a new environment with a lot of moving pieces around him. So again, I don't know that he's necessarily a slam dunk, but when I look at where he's being drafted just a little bit later, he seems to me to be just about as safe of a bet, and it seems like some of the ranks are there for him too.
Yeah, I agree. I think Reddick is a nice pick. I've got some Reddick shares. I do worry about the cosplaying in Japan aspect of his offseason, not reporting to any of the activities thus far and wanting a new contract and apparently not communicating with the Jets. We'll see if this stuff all gets resolved before training camp gets rolling and the preseason gets rolling. That's my only hesitation with Reddick, but I do like the fact, like you said, that you're getting a discount on a player that Adam and John both have ranked better than where he's going, which is not really the case with Kayvon Thibodeaux. So let's go next round, though, Scott. Who would be a guy you'd be looking at next round instead of Kayvon?
Yeah, so if you go all the way back to ADP 30.6, you'll see Alex Highsmith. He's another dual designation guy out of Pittsburgh. Put up decent numbers last year, very comparable points per game at 11.8 to Reddick, who was at 11.7. Both a little bit behind Thibodeaux, but I agree with you that Thibodeaux might be in line for a little bit of regression here. If you look at where Adam has him ranked, Adam has him as the 43rd overall player. So he's still being overdrafted somewhat, but I still have a preference there. He's Adams DL 35. I'm sorry, DL 25. Macri's DL 11. So Macri is pretty high on Highsmith. I've found myself drafting Highsmith a lot in that fourth round, beginning of the fifth, and I would honestly rather have Highsmith than Thibodeaux. And if I can get Highsmith a full 12 spots later, so a full round later in terms of ADP, and I think they're relatively similar players, give me Highsmith.
Yeah, I think passing on Kayvon there in the second round, if he slid to the third, I'm interested there, especially if he slides past the third. That's when I think we can start to talk. But he's not going to. I would be surprised if we looked at the ADP spreadsheet. I would be surprised what the latest Kayvon Thibodeaux has gone. And I would bet you dollars to donuts it's not outside of probably the first 40 picks. So there's just a lot of guys I like better in that range. I will say third round is typically, depending on where I'm at in the draft order, I'm probably switching to linebacker in that third round. So Highsmith's not a guy that I get a lot of, just because I try my best to go DL, because there's about 7 or 8 guys in that first round that I feel really good about. And typically you'll see Foye and Roquan get mixed in there. So as long as I'm in like that first 9 or 10 picks, I feel pretty good that I've got a shot to get, one of the big 6 guys, or a Danielle Hunter, or a Josh Allen. I'm not as crazy about Burns either, just because he's been a little middling, especially compared to some of the more elite options at the position. And being in a new situation, being opposite Kayvon, it's just kind of one of those situations I found myself avoiding the New York pass rushers quite a bit this offseason. So I love the Reddit call. Highsmith as well is a great option the next round. But if you want to double up and wait, Scott, what options are you looking at?
Yeah, before I hop into that, I did want to dovetail off something that you were saying, which was that you don't get Highsmith a lot because you go edge, and then you tend to look linebacker. I think one of the fun things about these drafts are there are so many different philosophies, and so much of it is conditional on where you're drafting in the round. So I've found myself in the unfortunate position of drafting 8, 9, 10 a lot. And at that point, I'll take a lot of Foye or Roquan or Fred Warner, and I'll draft less linebackers because I know I'm going to have that guaranteed production from those early round linebackers, and then go much heavier on defensive line in the middle rounds. So I think some of it's how the board falls to you, some of it's drafting philosophies, but that's one of the things that makes this format so much fun for me. Is I've done so many experiments of what if I go linebacker heavy early? What do my pass rushers look like? Or what if I just go best player available for the first 5 rounds and then start really filling gaps and thinking about it a little bit more deeply after that? But like I said, this is one of the features that I just absolutely love about best ball drafts, because there's so many ways you can go with it. But in terms of those later round guys, if you decide to pass on Thibodeaux or you go linebacker heavy early on, uh, then the 2 places that I like to look, that I have a lot of shares of, are Boye Mafe out of Seattle and Zadarius Smith in Cleveland. So Mafe's ADP is 70.8. Adam has him as 68, so a little tiny bit of value there. But where you really see the value is when you look at him relative to other defensive linemen. So he's being drafted as DL 40 when Adam has him as DL 35 and Macri has him as DL 22. So he represents a significant value there for me. I know he's coming off injury, so that makes people tend to forget about how good he was when he played. He averaged 12.6 points per game last season, which is 0.1 point behind Kayvon Thibodeaux, who's being drafted in the second round. So Boye Mafe is someone that I'm very happy to target. And then if you want to go several rounds later, and again double up, because I'm fairly certain these 2 guys' production are going to outproduce Kayvon Thibodeaux on most weeks, or one of them will outperform in a given week. And that's Zadarius Smith, who I mentioned. His ADP is 124.8. So you can fill a lot of holes and do a lot of other things and still get one of these good dual desi guys coming off of a down season. I'm not going to deny that. 8.3 points per game. The snaps were there. The production just really wasn't. But again, he's being drafted as DL 70, 124.8 ADP. Adam has him as 93 overall, so an incredible value there. DL 52 for Adam, DL 61 for Macri, being drafted as DL 70. And post draft, he's been slipping. So he's been becoming even more of a value. So I've found myself getting a lot of shares of Zadarius Smith in that 10th round, maybe 9th round, just to get ahead of it and maybe push his ADP back up a little bit. But I think if you punt on Thibodeaux, you go linebacker early, and then maybe the edges dry up. I don't think there's need to panic because you can get Mafe in the 6th and then Smith in the 8th or 9th, and you've got 2 solid dual desi players on your roster.
Yeah, that was something we talked about in the episode that Adam and I did, looking at our favorite picks from the first 10 rounds. Is there's just aisles of edge rushers in the ADP, really every position, because we noticed it with defensive tackle as well, kind of that cluster around Ed Oliver. There were a lot of defensive tackles going in that grouping that we didn't like because you could get Javon Hargrave, Deron Payne, and Jonathan Allen later on in the draft. And those were guys that we liked better than who was going in the earlier grouping. Same thing with edge rushers. If you go with a linebacker-heavy build, like you said, that's a great option sitting there for you as a dual desi guy. And I use the dual designation as a tiebreaker. I'm not trying to get cute and load up on guys that are dual desi to try to hack the draft. But that is something that you need to consider. And I say that from experience, especially in IDP Madness, which we have the second round of the mock draft coming next week. And that's where you're going to start to see drafters earn their money, is in those middle rounds. Because the top of the draft is pretty chalky, but the ADP starts to break down around the middle rounds. That's where guys start to plant flags, grab players that they like, and you're going to be left with more a multiplicity of decisions in the middle rounds. Whereas compared to in the first 8 to 10 rounds of these drafts, you're going to probably know within a 3 or 4 player band who's going to be available to you when your pick comes back up. So I love that you have these kind of dual desi options. I think Preston Smith is another guy I grab a ton of later in drafts if I want to punt. Yaya Diaby's still down there a little ways. So there are some really nice dual desi options that for whatever reason are just under the radar. So yeah, I think that's an important consideration, especially in shallower drafts like IDP Madness. I mentioned it on the last week's live stream. That saved my bacon in my IDP Madness League last year because my linebackers were total crap. And I had Khalil Mack and I think Harold Landry in my linebacker slot every single week. So they completely saved that team. So player number 1 that we're fading, Scott, is Kayvon Thibodeaux. Let's move to player number 2, and we're going to a linebacker. Who's your next fade?
So Patrick Queen is my next fade, and that's not just me being a Bengals fan and a Steelers hater. Josh, let me pose a question to you. Can you tell me the last Steelers inside linebacker to finish as an LB1?
Boy, I really couldn't. We were having this conversation on the IDP show a couple weeks back, and I was coming up blank. I mean, I'd go back to Ryan Shazier maybe, but no, I don't know who it was.
Yeah, I don't either. I could only go back to 2017, and I couldn't find one.
Wow.
The closest, and again, that's not counting TJ Watt, who used to get an LB designation, but he's an edge. He's a D lineman. Devin Bush was the closest in 2019. So as much as we love to romanticize Steelers defenders, the production just hasn't really been there. And I know it's sometimes perilous to tie positional production to specific teams, but we've also seen some teams be able to consistently churn out top fantasy assets. Think about Seattle's linebacking core, regardless of who's there, or even during injury, who is in as a replacement. Think about Atlanta's linebackers over the past several years. That makes me a lot more confident with guys like Caden Ellis, getting him late in the draft, even though I don't have him written up here. But Steelers linebackers are just not something that I tend to gravitate towards. They're very, lunch pail kinds of guys, come in and do their job and don't necessarily rack up the stats. And before last year, there was a lot of conversation about whether Patrick Queen was going to be a bust or not. He had a great year alongside Roquan Smith, and good for him for getting paid. But I don't know how sustainable that success is, and at an ADP of 33.2, that third round draft capital, there is another direction I have gone 10 times out of 10 when both the guys have been there. There is a guy in the next round who I would gladly take in the next round and use someone else there. And there's a bunch of deeper options, especially if you're following kind of late breaking news in the offseason. So Patrick Queen is a definite fade for me.
Yeah, I went Patrick Queen in the Madness mock draft 307. And that one was to get a share of a player that I don't have a lot of exposure to. B, Adam had just made a very compelling case for Patrick Queen on the episode I mentioned earlier, our favorite picks from the first 10 rounds. Also in that draft, linebackers were going off the board a lot earlier. And so it was kind of a multitude of factors, but there's a lot of linebackers right there in that range that I really like. I think you're probably going to talk about some of them. I mean, right before I picked, Terrell Bernard goes off the board. Quincy Williams is there. Azeez Al-Shaair is there. Frankie Louvu is who I picked in the 4th round. I would have been fine even flip-flopping those guys and going with Frankie in the 3rd round. After them, Logan Wilson, C.J. Mosley, Levante David, J.O.K. So I think the biggest knock I have against Patrick Queen is that there are so many guys I view very similar that I don't feel like I have to reach on Patrick Queen there if I don't want to go. If I want to go linebacker in the 3rd round, I don't have to reach on a guy like Queen because there's a lot of options I view very similar later on that I can pick up and feel really good about. Speaking of which, let's talk about, I think I've stole your thunder a little bit with a couple of these guys that you like better. Who do you like better in this round and then in the next round?
You mentioned Azeez Al-Shaair. Azeez Al-Shaair is typically available when Queen is available. His ADP is 36.7, so it's only 3 spots apart, but it's still behind Queen. And if you're giving me the option of those 2 players, give me Azeez Al-Shaair. He produced last year, 13.5 points per game. That's only 0.4 points per game behind what Patrick Queen did in a much better situation last year. I think Al-Shaair is walking into another fantastic situation where he should be able to produce as much, if not more, than he was able to do last year. So the ADP is a little bit worse. He's going off the board as linebacker 11. Adam has him as 24th overall, and with an ADP of 36, that's a steal. Adam has him as linebacker 9. Macri has him as linebacker 7, and he's being drafted as linebacker 11. These are all things that are better than where the guys are on Queen. So even though there is an argument to be made for Queen, and I'll probably get 1 or 2 shares just out of spite, just so if I'm wrong, hey, I'm wrong, but at least I'm getting some points. But Al-Shaair is someone who I would take 9 times out of 10, 10 times out of 10, except for those few where I'm kind of hedging my portfolio.
Yeah, there's an important lesson here is like Scott mentioned at the top of the show, we don't hate these players. We're not drafting them 0 times this offseason. What we're talking about here and what we really don't like are these ADPs. We can like a player and want exposure to that player if it involves less of an investment in taking that guy. If I can get certain guys, like I mentioned, Kayvon Thibodeaux in the 3rd or 4th round, that is a gamble I'm willing to take. But I'm not the opportunity cost of going Kayvon Thibodeaux in the middle of the 2nd round is too great. I don't want to have to pay that price to take Kayvon and then also pay the opportunity cost of passing on some of the other players that are selected in that range that I like a lot better. And so Patrick Queen is a guy that I think this is an important season for Patrick Queen. We've mentioned a few guys. Quay Walker's another guy that comes to mind. Important seasons to see what's going to happen with these guys in their career. And we are not saying that Patrick Queen is going to be a bust in Pittsburgh. We're just saying that at his cost, there are other guys that we would look to, and I'm with you. Aziz Al-Shaair is one of my most rostered players this offseason.
Mm-hmm. And then the next guy that I have is being drafted 15 spots behind Levante David. So I'm sorry, 15 spots behind Patrick Queen, and it is Levante David. So regardless of where you're picking in that third round, you have over a round worth of draft capital to play with. David's ADP is 48.1. That's good for linebacker 18. He averaged 17 points per game last season, and Devin White is gone. So Levante David is, I know he's older, but he was older last season and still performed really well. He is Adams' overall player number 25 with an ADP of 48.1. That's a great value. He's Adams' linebacker 10, being drafted as 18. He's Macri's linebacker 9, again, being drafted as linebacker 18. So I would much rather, if my options, maybe Queen and Al-Shaair are gone, am I going to reach for a linebacker who I don't like as much in the third round? No, I'll wait until mid-end fourth and scoop up Levante David because he's being criminally underdrafted.
Yeah, we have a saying on the IDP show going back years that Levante David has been discount Bobby Wagner his whole career.
Yep.
And that continues here, where we see right after Patrick Queen goes, we see Bobby Wagner going as LB 11. We have Quincy Williams wedged in between there. Patrick Queen, LB9, Quincy Williams, LB10, Bobby Wagner, LB11, and then, as you mentioned, Scott, scroll all the way down, LB18, there's Levante David. Make it make sense. I think Levante David is one of the best values in drafts, and you don't have to chase him up the board because he is consistently sitting there later in drafts than he should be going. So I'm with you 100%. We are in lockstep here. These are some of my favorite linebacker targets. But if you want to wait and double up, you've got a couple good options here as well.
Yeah, and I like Tyrell Dodson and David Long. And if you're looking for some good justifications on both of them, Jason King just wrote something about that Seattle linebacker room. And the ultimate conclusion, it was from more of a dynasty perspective, but the ultimate conclusion is they're both good assets to have. They're both good LB3s, whether you want to go with Dodson or Jerome Baker. I have Dodson here just because of his ADP. His ADP is 107.4. That's good for linebacker 58. Adam has him as 99, so a little bit of value there overall, but LB 41. Macri has him as LB 55. So again, you're getting some value. And that 99, I should mention, this is why it says pro tip for Adam's rankings to click on the spreadsheet. It seems like that might have been updated just within the past like 24 hours because he's not listed in the top 100 if you're just sort of on the site. But when you get into the sheets, that's where you can see some of the really good stuff. So Adam has moved Dodson up to 99, and that represents value. And with David Long, his ADP, I would be amazed if it doesn't skyrocket. I just saw that the Green Dot King himself, Mike Wohlert, retweeted I think it was a beat reporter reporting that David Long was going to wear the green dot. Let's go. I have David Long in Dynasty in probably half of my Dynasty leagues. I liked him in Tennessee. I was a little bit disappointed with that first season in Miami, but now that he's going to have that role where snaps are king and he is going to be on the field, his ADP is 187.3 currently, which is good for LB 65. Adam, this is one that I don't think he's updated since that news broke just probably 24 hours ago because Adam has him as 271, very, very deep in there. And their linebacker rankings, Adam is LB 67, Macri is LB 64. But this is one that is going to start moving very, very quickly. He was sort of a speculative play in case he got that role in previous drafts. Now it seems like he is getting that role. He has shown some flashes of production. And so if I'm going to pass on, if I'm going to do a really DL heavy build in those first 4 or 5 rounds where I miss out on not just Queen, but Al-Shaair and David, then I'll get Dodson in the 8th or 9th. And David Long, again, that ADP is going to go up, but it's still 12th or 13th round. You should be able to get him here in the short term.
Yeah, he is one that I expect to probably move up for a lot of folks into that sort of 40 to 50 range LB ranking because we brought this up a couple weeks ago on the IDP show. There's just certain position groups that people are just like, no interest, no thank you, don't know, don't care. We mentioned Miami's second linebacker. We mentioned Detroit's second edge rusher. If you look at the drafts, people are just like, no thank you. I will just look elsewhere. And you're right, with this news that David Long is the presumed green dot, I think that is going to skyrocket his value. I think you will see him be one of the biggest climbers. I will say about Dotson, I've mentioned before that there are certain players that I like a lot better for best ball. Players like Christian Harris, players
Mhm.
like Jeremiah Owusu, Koromoa, and there are certain players that I like better in weekly managed leagues. And guys like Tyrell Dotson, Jordan Hicks come to mind, those steady Eddie producers, because there are certain guys that win you best ball leagues that are going to drive you crazy in your managed leagues. And so Tyrell Dotson I look at as one of those kind of safe floor plays. He's a nice guy. Same with David Long, right? It's a great reinforcement late in your draft, especially if you're a little light on LB. But I don't want to be overly reliant on these safe options in best ball that are more floor plays like a Tyrell Dotson. But like you mentioned, if you're going DL heavy, snatching these guys up late in the draft, that's a great strategy to pepper guys like that in, especially now with Long. We know Dotson and Jerome Baker are the two LBs there in Seattle. We know McDonald used two LBs in Baltimore, so those guys should be on the field a ton. And now we feel a lot better about David Long's role in Miami. So those guys, if you're going with those later kind of floor plays to solidify your LB room, don't go speculative. Don't go Leo Chenal.
Mhm.
Go with a Tyrell Dotson. Go with a David Long. Give yourself some sort of security so that those guys are not just zeros for you week. They don't ever crack your lineup. Give yourself a chance here in case injuries hit, in case guys don't turn out like you'd hoped. Give yourself some dudes that can get in there and give you, you know, 10 to 13 points consistently every week.
Yeah, and I like getting some floor guys in most positions. I like to swing for the fences early on and then reinforce them. Or, like I mentioned, sometimes I do with linebackers. I get some very safe linebackers very early in the draft. And then I'll draft more dual desi guys because I'll look for those big pop weeks. Knowing that I have a safe floor, I can be more aggressive in the middle and the back end of a draft. So I think there's a role for the floor guys. It's definitely not as prominent as it is in those week to week managed leagues, but it's a nice way to hedge against some of the variability, especially if you are someone who goes with a lot of dual desi and you're sort of penciling them in your mind as your linebackers. All right, you're unless you have a whole lot of them, you're gonna need some traditional inside linebackers that are gonna be getting 80-90% of snaps and might have a sack or a pick or something that gets you a big splash, but they're going to get you 8 to 10 tackles and you're going to be in a good spot there. And then if your ceiling guys hit, then great, you didn't have to use them. If they bust, it doesn't tank you 10 points.
Yeah. So Kayvon Thibodeaux, Patrick Queen, two players that I would say are a little bit divisive, at least in the IDP community. Some folks are a little more excited for these guys than others. But your next player, Scott, is, I think, a universally beloved defensive back. So I have a feeling that this fade may just be part of the whole fade DB in best ball strategy. Or maybe you just have concerns about this next player. But either way, explain yourself.
I have no concerns about Antoine Winfield. I just don't want a DB at ADP 45.1. I've experimented a little bit with going DB heavy early in draft. I mean, early fourth round, fifth round, sixth round to see what was there left in terms of DL. And there's some great IDLs left at the end of drafts that you can use to backfill your roster, just like you use corners oftentimes to backfill the end of your roster. But to me, there's just so much edge and DL and linebacker value to be had still in the fourth round or the fifth round where Antoine Winfield is being drafted that I love the player. And if he was sitting there around later, I would snatch him up in a heartbeat. or if the board is shaking out in such a way that I don't know. Actually, I can't imagine a board where I would take him at ADP right now. But he's a great player. He is being drafted as the DB1, ranked by Adam as the DB2, and John as the DB3. The ADP is actually really close to Adam's overall ranking of 46. So, there is a good calibration that's happening there, but it's not my calibration. I would rather get a different option as my first DB taken if I have to take one that early. And more than likely, I would rather wait. And so you'll see I don't have a next round pick. I have another guy for this round. I don't have a next round. I have a 3 rounds later that I think is just as good, if not better, than Winfield, that I will gladly take and just scoop up the value that people are dropping me by taking DB earlier than they need to.
Yeah, I always think about when I do these drafts and get to the end of them, I try to really log in my memory, how do I feel about this team as I scroll back and look over my roster? Because that for me speaks to the builds that I feel best about. And you should always stay water. I know this is a term the fantasy footballers coined of don't go into your drafts rigid, saying this is what I'm going to do in this round, this is what I'm going to do in the next round. Let the board come to you. Don't chase players up the board. Let the value fall and scoop it up and profit. But I do try to pay attention to which builds I feel best about. I'm in Best Ball 27 right now, and that draft I am going to stack 13 DBs as my last 13 picks. And I got to tell you, Scott, this is the team I probably feel the best about out of every single draft that I've done this offseason. So that's just a big screaming billboard for fade DB. And not to say, again, we love Antoine Winfield Jr. We love Kyle Hamilton. We love guys like Devon Witherspoon and Brian Branch and Jesse Bates, these DBs that go early in drafts. But you look right around where Antoine Winfield Jr. is going. Right before him goes Frankie Louvu, Azeez Al-Shaair. Right after him goes Alex Singleton, Levante David, J.O.K., Uchenna Nwosu, C.J. Mosley, Tremaine Edmonds, Big Bob Spillane. I mean, it's just too much value. We talked about opportunity cost. I know I can get players that are closer to Antoine Winfield later, much later in my draft, whereas the drop-off from the other players that I just mentioned to the players at that same position later in drafts is much, much bigger. You cannot get players of JOK and Azeez Al-Shaair and Big Bob Spillane's caliber 12, 13 rounds later in the draft. You just can't. But I can find guys that are a tier or two down, at least for 2024 from Winfield, and feel really good about it.
Yeah, and this is another one of those great examples why I like to throw out, hey, here, draft these 2 guys later instead of this 1 guy now. And that's going to become a more and more viable strategy as the summer goes on and we have more clarity about which corners are going to be playing which roles and which defenses. I know Johnny the Greek is already sending out preview newsletters for corners, and I'm reading those. Okay, add them to the queue, take this guy out of the queue. So as we're getting more information there, and again, they're not going to produce week to week like Antoine Winfield. I have no hopes of that happening. But if you give me 2 or 3 guys, I would rather have those 2 or 3 bets that one of them is going to equal or outperform Winfield in that given week and take a Al-Shaair or a Levante David or some of the edges that you mentioned that were still there rather than Antoine Winfield.
Yeah, it's about spike weeks with DB. You see that a lot more. There are guys that can get into that starting lineup a lot easier at DB because at least the scoring set that we use, which is big 3 scoring, more of a big play type of scoring, rewards interceptions, passes defended really highly, as they should be rewarded in IDP fantasy football. And so there are just a ton of guys. I can much easier find a group of DBs that will have a good shot at cracking my lineup 4 or 5 times in a season. Whereas finding those late edges and linebackers, it's just tougher to do because it's about volume at that point in the draft. And you can find so many safeties, so many cornerbacks. And that's the other thing, too, why you may want to look linebacker is because even those dual desi guys, a lot of them are not going to see the field more than 70% of snaps, especially as you get later in drafts. They're rotational pieces, they're speculative kind of pieces. And so to fill that linebacker slot, you want to have some of those 90% of snap green dot guys so that you just have like locked and loaded dudes who are going to play enough to score enough points to make your lineup that week. DB, because it's DB and not safety and cornerback, it's all lumped in together. You've got 5 to 6 players per team. You're looking at 150 plus players that you can reasonably expect to get north of 75-80% of snaps at both safety, outside corner. A lot of teams are employing a slot corner. So there's just so many great options late that there's just no reason to invest early in DB unless you see, there have been times where I have taken Kyle Hamilton. Winfield typically doesn't fall far enough, but if these guys slide down into the 7th, 8th, 9th round, everyone's just playing the game of chicken to see who's going to be the first one to take it. I'll do it. Mm-hmm. I will absolutely do it because at that point, the guys that are being selected, Winfield, Kyle Hamilton, those kind of cheat code DBs are leaps and bounds better than the options that are available there.
Yeah, with that thought in mind, if I was in a position where it was round 7 and Winfield and Hamilton were there, Hamilton is the guy that I would prefer. Again, it's no knock on Winfield. I think they're going to be neck and neck. I just like Hamilton's versatility. He's ranked very highly. Adam has him as his DB1. Macri has him as his DB6 for the season. And so, again, it's not someone that I will be drafting unless they fall at value. But if I'm sitting there in the 7th round, and it is that game of chicken. It's like, oh, I'm going to draft DBs late, so I'm not taking any one of them. And Winfield and Hamilton are both sitting there. I'll take Hamilton. And so that was be my same round pick, but that's more, you said stay water. I get to be kind of rigid whenever I'm doing something like this, where it's like, no. I want to find someone within that same round and then go down around. And but I need to be a little bit more flexible because honestly, I'm probably not going to have a single share of Winfield or Hamilton, because even in those game of chickens, someone will blink before I do, and then I'll wish that I did, maybe. But I think that Hamilton, Winfield, 1A, 1B, but I'll take Hamilton because he can often be gotten maybe a few picks later with an ADP of 48.4 compared to 45.1. So if that translates and extrapolates in the game of chicken to a gap of 6 or 7 instead of the typical 3 or 4, then give me Hamilton 6 or 7 spots later than Antoine Winfield.
Yeah, so Hamilton, he definitely is going to slide more than Winfield is. I think that is universally we're seeing that. If one of those guys is going to slide, it's typically not Antoine Winfield Jr. A lot of great options later, Scott, in drafts. You've got, I consider another elite option going a lot later than the other two guys who I see in the same tier as this player. And then you have some nice late round options, especially with the new kick return rules. Hit me with the guys that you would rather have going later in drafts.
Yeah, so a little bit later is Derwin James. And I know Derwin James didn't have a Derwin James year last year, and some people are saying it's the decline that's here. I don't see it. I'd very, very happily have Derwin James at his ADP of 74.6, because that is around where I might start to consider drafting a DB, than Winfield or Hamilton in the 40s. So give me, almost 30 picks later, a guy that is in that same tier. Macri has him as his DB1. Adam has him as his DB3. So they're all grouped really tightly, even though you might want to say there's a tier break between Winfield, Hamilton, and James. I don't think so. I don't see it. And so if I'm going to be taking a DB early, if you look at my roster builds, the DB early that I take is James, because you can still get him at his ADP is still a decent value. And again, it's around where I am with that philosophy of waiting on DBs. But the other part of my philosophy that has been a thing since I started playing IDP a long, long time ago when Devin Hester had the DB designation, and I scooped him up and I just ate up those return yards. Kayvon Nixon, who the market is catching up to, his ADP has jumped 50 spots since the draft. So you can't get him at as much of a steal. His ADP is now 148.3 as DB 25, but this guy has the potential to put up another monster year, especially with the fact that touchbacks aren't going to be a thing anymore. So just the sheer volume that he's likely to get as that kick return specialist and pretty locked into that role in Green Bay. Give me him as DB25. I will gladly take him in the 10th or 11th round to get ahead of ADP to get him on my roster. But if he falls around that 150 range, that's a steal. Adam has him as his DB 76 or his overall 76 again in his newest when you click into the sheets. So Kayvon Nixon is a great value. The market is catching up to it, but they're not there yet. And so finding ways to snag him when you can. And the last guy who I have to mention, who is completely off of everyone's radar except mine, because I just had such a soft spot for him and drafted him everywhere in Dynasty, was Marcus Jones. I know Marcus Jones was hurt last year and didn't play, but if my memory is serving correctly, it was a shoulder injury. He didn't tear up his ACL. He didn't, have a devastating Achilles injury that, we're wondering what his speed is going to be like. He banged up his shoulder and needed surgery, and now he's back. He is penciled in, if you go onto our lads, as the starting nickelback for New England, although that's always kind of a fluid defense to try to predict. He's penciled in as the starting punt returner, and he just has to overtake Jalen Reagor as the kick returner, who may not even end up making that team. So Marcus Jones is being drafted at 303.1. So you can get him in the 25th round of your drafts, and he has Kayvon Nixon upside. Kayvon Nixon is that kick returner who plays nickel corner, and we don't know what the new coaching staff in New England is going to do with Marcus Jones, if he's going to play any offense like he did for Belichick a little bit in his rookie year, but that doesn't matter. If he's getting reliable defensive snaps and that kick return upside, he averaged 14.1 points per game the last time he played a full season in that role as a rookie, and that included a 0 in week 1 because he was a rookie and just had a couple of snaps, and I want to say like a 1.4 in week 2. So sign me up for Marcus Jones, and if you look at my roster share, you will see I am already very well signed up for him.
Yeah, overweight on Marcus Jones. Not a bad thing, especially if he gets the role that we hope he does. And that's the gamble that you play, especially with these DBs who have the kick and punt return roles, is are they going to have those roles when the season start? Are they going to maintain those roles? Banking on the new kick return rules, we've talked about it a little bit. I do think it will make a demonstrable difference in how those guys are valued that gets those roles. How much of a difference? I think we may be overestimating that a little bit. I'll be very curious to see as the season goes along what kind of upgrade or uptick we're seeing in, points per game from players who have those kick and punt return roles. But if you can snatch up 2 of those guys and you guessed correctly that they are the kick and punt return specialists for their teams, especially in this scoring system, Big 3 scoring, which does reward kick and punt return yards, tremendous, humongous upside for guys that are going super late in drafts. Just real quick, as we put a bow on the Antoine Winfield DB discussion, this was what I was talking about when I said playing the game of chicken in our very first best ball draft this offseason. Best ball number 1. Everyone was playing the game of chicken because they did not want to get made fun of on our podcast. Adam was able to get Kyle Hamilton at the 708. Jeez. So that's like that. If you give me Kyle Hamilton that late, and that's what he said. He's like, look, I've got a zig. Everyone is doing this, so I've got to do something different. If you look in the ADP, the latest that Antoine Winfield has gone is pick number 70. So that is, the couple picks before the end of the 6th round. And Kyle Hamilton, the latest he has gone is pick number 80. So if you can get into one of those drafts where people are pushing these elite DB options way down the board, sign me up for that. But otherwise, go the strategy we've talked about here, which is late DB, and especially grab those late DBs, late DBs who have kick and punt return upside. So, Scott, let's wrap this episode up with your fourth fade. This is a guy who enjoyed a breakout season last year, and I'm curious to hear why you're fading this guy at cost. Who's your next player?
Yeah, so my final fade at cost is Carl Granderson. His cost currently post draft is 51.1. That's good for DL 30. Granderson had a very productive year last year, and I have hopes for him because I have him in a couple of dynasty leagues. But he's not someone, even in those dynasty leagues, I traded and drafted defensive ends because I wasn't convinced about repeat production for Granderson. So that's what's coming here. I think at the ADP he's being drafted at, there are better options. People love to sleep on defensive tackles. I know I have a soft spot for defensive tackles, which you're going to see as I go through all of the alternatives that I would rather have or other strategies I would consider over Carl Granderson. But he had a 63.6 pass rush grade on PFF last year. That's not great. You usually don't get that kind of sack production out of it. If you look at his pressure to sack rate, he was getting one sack every 6.4 pressures, which is a pretty low rate. And that might be able to stay somewhat stable, but it's not going to improve from there. So I feel like we've definitely seen that ceiling. And to me, given that pressure to sack ratio is more aligned with higher base talent pass rushers from a PFF grading perspective, leads me to believe that he is a regression candidate. I still want to get him because he's going to get snaps. They don't have, Cam Jordan is very old and still productive. I actually grabbed Jordan in that dynasty league for a 6th-round pick to have there in case he has a resurgence for one of his final seasons. But Carl Granderson is someone just at that cost that I'm not really interested in. Adam has him as his overall 67, and he's being drafted 51.1. So that, to me, shows that he's being overdrafted. He's ranked as DL 30. Adam has him as DL 34. Macri has him as DL 62. So the more I dug into this, the more I felt confident that, I hope he does well for that dynasty league, but I'm not going to bank on it. And there are other safer options and other upside options that you can take in these positions in the same round, in the very next round.
Yeah, this is one of those conversations that resorts back to how do you typically like to build your teams? And I mentioned the earlier rounds as chalkier and knowing essentially within a 3 or 4 player band what guys are going to be there for you. So I will say a lot of my builds shake out differently after about round 9 or 10. But these first 10 rounds, I typically am shopping in the same aisle for players just because the ADP holds pretty true. And there's just certain aisles, like we talked about, of edge rusher and linebacker that I'm not wanting to shop in. And this is one of those areas of the draft where I would just much rather go linebacker because you look at who's going right before Carl Granderson by ADP. It's Frankie Louvu. It's Azeez Al-Shaair. Right after him, linebacker-wise, goes Alex Singleton, Levante David, JOK. I would take those 5 linebackers 100 times out of 100 over someone like Carl Granderson. So this is less about the players at his position going around him and more a preference of I'd rather be shopping in the linebacker aisle in this round than in the defensive line aisle. And even if I am, let's say I've gone linebacker heavy and I don't want to go with a 4th or 5th or 6th linebacker at that point, I would much rather go with a Jeffrey Simmons or a Christian Wilkins, a George Karlaftis, or a Bryce Huff in that aisle. So who are some of the other guys that you're looking at instead of Carl Granderson there, Scott?
Yeah, so the 1-for-1 swap that I have would be Dexter Lawrence. I know Dexter Lawrence plays interior, Granderson is an edge rusher, But if you look at Dexter Lawrence's underlying metrics, he was someone that I was hoping I'd be able to get in the 70s, 80s, 90s, that people would be sleeping on him. They're not as much as I thought. His ADP is 56.4. And according to Adam, he's being significantly overdrafted. Adam has him as overall 84. So he's being reached for. And I'd love him a whole lot more at 84 than at 56.4. But I sort of went through the thought experiment of, would I rather have Carl Granderson or Dexter Lawrence, if those are the two best available edge rushers when I'm on the clock and I need edge rusher. I know PFF grades aren't everything, but I do a lot of modeling of defensive tackle performance, and snaps are king, as they are for most IDP positions. But PFF pass rush grades do translate to production, and to a lesser extent, run defense grades translate into fantasy production. Dexter Lawrence was PFF's overall DL2. That's DL2. So that's including edge rushers. So his overall grade was the second best of all defensive linemen last season. He had the third best overall pass rush grade, I think behind only Parsons and Crosby, and the sixth best run defense grade across all defensive linemen. If you look at his production, it wasn't there, but it was also pretty crazy that he had 65 pressures and only 6 sacks out of them. That's 1 sack per every 10 pressures, and that is primed for the kind of regression we like, where that number is going to come down and his sack numbers are only likely to go up, especially with the increased attention that people are going to have to pay to Burns now opposite Thibodeaux, rather than Azeez Ojulari over there. And granted, losing Leonard Williams in the middle of last season hurt, but he still was relatively productive. So I would take Dexter Lawrence over Carl Granderson if I was drafting in that area. As much as I like the guy, I don't know that I'm taking him at 56.4 at ADP right now. But if we were, say, a round later and they were both there, I would take Lawrence.
Yeah, Lawrence is a guy, like you said, I'm probably not shopping in that aisle where he would be going, just because that does feel a little rich. But he's a player that does tend to fall. I know Evan Ringler has talked a lot about he ends up with a ton of Dexter Lawrence just because he falls to a point where it's like, well, shoot, if nobody's going to appreciate Sexy Dexy, I sure will. I do love the argument for the positive regression there that we should be seeing from Dexter Lawrence. He does have help now along that defensive line, more help than he had last year, at least on the edges with Brian Burns and Kayvon Thibodeaux. So you've got a couple other options here, Scott. Like you said, you're showing love to the defensive tackle, but one of these guys especially is one of my very favorite targets where he's going. So hit us with the rest of your list, guys that you're taking instead.
Yeah, so in terms of a next round safe play, I have Derek Brown. Derek Brown's ADP is 64, again, compared to Granderson's 51.1. So that's good for DL 37, so 7 DL spots behind. Adam has him as DL 36, so it's pretty well aligned with where he is there. Macri's a little bit higher on him at DL 27. Adam has him at overall 72, so a little bit of an overpay according to Adam to get him at 64. But to me, as much as I think Lawrence is an upside play with the pass rush abilities that didn't translate into as many sacks as they should have last season, Brown has an incredible floor. You know, if you play in some no position left behind leagues that do premiums for tackles by defensive tackles, he was DT1 in a lot of those formats. So he gets tackles. And I know he didn't fill up the stat sheet in terms of sacks, but again, going back to his pressures were lower, 41. So that's 24 less pressures than Lawrence, 17 less pressures than Granderson, but he only had 2 sacks. That's 1 sack per 20 pressures. That is going to, if I will be shocked and amazed and dismayed if he does not end up with more than 2 sacks next season. So I think he is a great floor play that has sneakier upside than people are giving him credit for. I expected him, I know we're not separating out into defensive tackles and defensive ends or edges, but I really thought he would be one of the top 2 or 3 defensive tackles selected in drafts, and he's just not being that. So if I can get him even at his current ADP, which might be a little bit rich at 64, I'd be still happy with that. But I'd also be very happy going down that aisle a little bit further and getting an Ed Oliver. Ed Oliver dealt with some injuries last season, but when he played well. He averaged 12.8 points per game, which is only zero point 0.2 points behind Carl Granderson, who's being drafted 30 spots higher. So Ed Oliver is being drafted as DL 41. Adam has him as DL 32. Macri's a little bit lower and has him as DL 54. So if you split the difference, you're close to what that ADP is. But Adam also has him as his 63rd best overall player, being drafted at 81.2. And he is actually sliding for some reason post draft. He's down 15 spots after the NFL draft. So his value is just increasing as time is going by. So he's someone who both Adam and John have ranked higher than Carl Granderson, who you can get 30 picks later. So Ed Oliver is someone who I would love to come back and double up with. And then at the very end of the draft, someone who I have been getting near the end of almost every draft I'm in is David Onyemata. And I owe David Onyemata a personal apology because he is down 46 spots in ADP post-draft. And that's because I think I did 8 pre-draft drafts and only 2 post-drafts. I was busy with my rookie drafts and getting the combine going. I am very high on David Onyemata. The biggest concern about him is his snap share. He plays about 65% of snaps on average last season. But still, he was PFF's DT9 in terms of his grading. He averaged 10.2 points per game, so he's still over that 10-point threshold that we would love to see. And his ADP is 308.1. So if you're telling me I can get a defensive lineman who's going to produce an average of 10.2 points per game with a few boom games that are going to clearly get him in my lineup, I would much rather in best ball, in redraft, in dynasty. If you offer me Ed Oliver and David Onyemata for Carl Granderson, I will give you all of my copies of Carl Granderson for that deal.
Yeah, this is the game of just look at the round. Look at the round. This is why the ADP is so helpful. Is it's if you know these are going to probably be the cast of characters available there in the round where Ed Oliver is being selected, just play the game of who would I rather take at their cost? And when you look at starting that 7th round, right? Because 6 rounds times 12 is 72. So starting after 72, you've got Gregory Rousseau, Ed Oliver. So you've got the teammates there, which I think is kind of interesting. Then you have Dallas Turner, Josie Jewell, Derek Brown, Devin White, Byron Young, Christian Harris, Blake Cashman, Jack Campbell, Leatu Latu, Andrew Van Ginkel. You're starting to, as we mentioned in that episode, you're starting to get into that area of the draft where things feel a lot less certain. Mm-hmm. Right, you've got some rookies sprinkled in there. You've got guys like Jack Campbell. You've got guys switching teams like Andrew Van Ginkel in there. So Ed Oliver is just a rock-solid option. There are so many sexy D-tackle options late in drafts that I would much rather. Now, the thing with defensive tackles, you don't have any of these guys that are dual desi. So a defensive tackle heavy build, you do miss out on that edge. So you do have to take that into consideration that if you're going with a D tackle heavy build, it's probably not best to do that in a shallower format like IDP Madness because you do, I believe, want some of those dual desi guys in there just for a little bit of injury protection. But in a typical 31 round draft like we do most of the offseason, DL builds that are reliant on D-tackle, not necessarily a bad thing because those guys have big spike week upside as well, like you mentioned. So I'm with you. Give me those guys that you mentioned over Carl Granderson. If I went back and looked, I would say I probably do not have any shares of Granderson at this point, and I have a lot of shares of some of these other guys, especially Ed Oliver. So, Scott, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your fades at ADP. If you'd like to draft with us, come on over, theidpshow.com. Scott, I mentioned it at the top of the show. You've launched some combined drafts. We've already had 5 that have filled up. I think you are going to be launching number 6 and number 7 here very soon. Tell the folks at home as we wrap up here, what do you have planned for the rest of this off season, and what can we look forward to from you once the regular season kicks off?
Yeah, so the rest of the off season, I'm going to be doing more of these combined best balls. I really love having offense and defense and trying to help the show build out some good ADP to see where not just defensive players are being taken relative to one another, which is incredibly valuable, but also for those of us who do tournaments or just play in a lot of combined leagues to begin with, how the ADP is going to shake out whenever you stack those up. So I'll be really happy to be launching a few more of those and plan on running more of them throughout the summer. I'm working on the new State of IDP survey that will be going out later this summer to try to, again, just get a finger on the pulse of IDP leagues because it helps us to figure out where the gaps are in terms of what you're looking for. And I share that far and wide and the data far and wide to try to make it so there's more resources, not just from us, but from everyone to help this community to grow and really thrive and to build better IDP players. So those are going to be the big things I'm working on. And then once the season starts, I'm going to still do my DT deep dive, looking at DT streaming options inspired by Johnny the Greek's incredible work on cornerbacks. I thought, you know what, you can probably do this with defensive tackles too. And after 3 years of data and testing it out, it seems like you can. So I do still rank the top ones in case you're trying to decide who to start in a given week. But a lot of that gets into, it's usually about 130 to 150 defensive tackles I'll have ranked for a given week. And then last year, I also launched a defensive end specific article only looking at deep plays. And that worked out pretty well. We see a lot of names that are being drafted heavily now. Yaya Diaby was in that article several times. Malcolm Kuntz, Anthony Jennings, a lot of guys who are starting to get some buzz now. And so I plan on, again, looking at very, very low rostership edges for guys that you may want to get ahead of and even consider playing if it's an advantageous matchup for that week.
Yeah, Scott's doing great work, guys. Make sure you check it out, theidpshow.com. You'll be the first to find out about Scott's combined leagues when they launch, and all of his work will be over there coming up this season. So look forward to that. Scott, look forward to the State of IDP. Always so fascinating to see, because we get in our kind of mind how we like to play IDP. It's always so fascinating to see how the sort of community at large plays this game that we love so much. And we hope that you will begin to mix some more IDP best ball into how you play this great game. So for Scott, I'm Josh. Thank you all so much for tuning in to this episode of IDP Drafts. Like I mentioned, we will be back next week with the second installment in the IDP Madness mock draft. But until then, y'all take care, and we'll see you on the next episode of IDP Drafts.